What's up? Today, we're going to dive straight into what is going to be the most important video I've made to this fucking day. Living in the now. So, today, this video is called The Fall of the Feds. Now, I'm going to introduce you before I just start throwing out all this important information at you. I started my journey of what they call consciousness and waking up by watching this documentary called Zeitgeist. Now, in this documentary, there were 3 very key facts that are going to change your perception about your environment. Those 3 facts are 9/11 is fake, Jesus is a mythological creature, and most importantly, the one that nobody really caught on to, it seems like, the Federal Reserve Bank is enslaving you currently. And I like how they did that, because they gave you the 3 different settings of enslavement. They gave you the one that was enslaving you beforehand, which was the religion. Now that you're free of that, they told you about how 9/11, which was a current event around that time, was a hoax. 9/11 was being used in order to shut down our country. And finally, they introduce you your new slave master, your current slave master, and your current oppressor for the whole country, no matter if you white, black, Mexican, or fucking Asian, or fucking mulatto, or whatever you want to call it. The Federal Reserve Bank is oppressing you, and it is controlling your every single move. Now, once I saw that documentary, it really threw me down a loophole, because the more information I started finding out after that was, it was very contradictory, because half of the people who are going to tell you about the conscious and the waking up and the spiritual side of stuff, they are leaving out this information about the Federal Reserve. They tell you about black and white. They tell you about, how celebrities ain't shit, and they tell you about the Illuminati. These are all under the play calling, as you could say, or under the control, or under the distraction of the Federal Reserve Bank. Now, this is important because over the last 7 years, I've become awake, you could say. I've become more spiritual and whatever. But as a result of that, I have realized that I have sacrificed a very key knowledge, which nobody is talking about. They're ignoring it. As you become more conscious and awake, I question you, or I push you to question yourself, to ask, am I suppressing the truth by trying to make myself a better person? And that's going to be a deep question for a lot of y'all, because a lot of people are, hurt and damaged, and they need to heal themselves. And that's beautiful. But
(1775), the American Revolutionary War began as the American colonies sought to detach from England and its oppressive monarchy. Though many reasons are cited for the revolution, one in particular sticks out as the prime cause: that King George III of England outlawed the interest-free, independent currency the colonies were producing and using for themselves, in turn forcing them to borrow money from the Central Bank of England at interest, immediately putting the colonies into debt. And as Benjamin Franklin later wrote, the refusal of King George III to allow the colonies to operate an honest money system which freed the ordinary man from the clutches of the money manipulators was probably the prime cause of the Revolution. In 1783, America won its independence from England. However, its battle against the central bank concept and the corrupt, greed-filled men associated with it had just begun. So what is a central bank? A central bank is an institution that produces the currency of an entire nation. Based on historical precedent, two specific powers are inherent in central banking practice: the control of interest rates and the control of the money supply, or inflation. The central bank does not simply supply a government's economy with money, it loans it to them at interest. Then, through the use of increasing and decreasing the supply of money, the central bank regulates the value of the currency being issued. It is critical to understand that the entire structure of this system can only produce one thing in the long run: debt. It doesn't take a lot of ingenuity to figure this scam out. For every single dollar produced by the central bank is loaned at interest. That means every single dollar produced is actually the dollar plus a certain percent of debt based on that dollar. And since the central bank has the monopoly over the production of the currency for the entire country, and they loan each dollar out with immediate debt attached to it, where does the money to pay for the debt come from? It can only come from the central bank again, which means the central bank has to perpetually increase its money supply to temporarily cover the outstanding debt created, which in turn, since that new money is loaned out at interest as well, creates even more debt. The end result of this system without fail is slavery, for it is impossible for the government and thus the public to ever come out of the self-generating debt. The founding fathers of this country were well aware of this. By the early 20th century, the U.S. had already implemented and removed a few central banking systems, which were swindled into place by ruthless banking interests. At this time, the dominant families in the banking and business world were the Rockefellers, the Morgans, the Warburgs, the Rothschilds. And in the early 1900s, they sought to push, once again, legislation to create another central bank. However, they knew the government and public were very weary of such an institution, so they needed to create an incident to affect public opinion. So, J.P. Morgan, publicly considered a financial luminary at the time, exploited his mass influence by publishing rumors that a prominent bank in New York was insolvent or bankrupt. Morgan knew this would cause mass hysteria, which would affect other banks as well. And it did. The public, in fear of losing their deposits, immediately began mass withdrawals. Consequently, the banks were forced to call in their loans, causing the recipients to sell their property, and thus a spiral of bankruptcies, repossessions, and turmoil emerged. Putting the pieces together a few years later, Frederick Allen of Life magazine wrote, "The Morgan interests took advantage to precipitate the panic, guiding it shrewdly as it progressed." Unaware of the fraud, the Panic of 1907 led to a congressional investigation headed by Senator Nelson Aldrich, who had intimate ties to the banking cartels and later became part of the Rockefeller family through marriage. The commission, led by Aldrich, recommended a central bank should be implemented so a panic like 1907 could never happen again. This was the spark the international bankers needed to initiate their plan. In 1910, a secret meeting was held at a J.P. Morgan estate on Jekyll Island off the coast of Georgia. It was there that the central banking bill called the Federal Reserve Act was written. This legislation was written by bankers, not lawmakers. This meeting was so secretive, so concealed from government and public knowledge, that the 10 or so figures who attended were told they could only use their first names in addressing each other. After this bill was constructed, it was then handed over to their political frontman, Senator Nelson Aldrich, to push through Congress. And in 1913, with heavy political sponsorship by the bankers, Woodrow Wilson became president, having already agreed to sign the Federal Reserve Act in exchange for campaign support. And 2 days before Christmas, when most of Congress was at home with their families, the Federal Reserve Act was voted in, and Wilson in turn made it law. Years later, Woodrow Wilson wrote, in regret, Congressman Lewis McFadden also expressed the truth after the passage of the bill. A world banking system was being set up here, a superstate controlled by international bankers, acting together to enslave the world for their own pleasure. The Fed has usurped the government. Now, the public was told that the Federal Reserve System was an economic stabilizer, and inflation and economic crises were a thing of the past. Well, as history has shown, nothing is further from the truth. The fact is, the international bankers now had a streamlined machine to expand their personal ambitions.
It's alive! It's alive! It's alive!
For example, from 1914 to 1919, the Fed increased the money supply by nearly 100%, resulting in extensive loans to small banks and the public. Then, in 1920, the Fed called in mass percentages of the outstanding money supply, thus resulting in the supporting banks having to call in huge numbers of loans, and, just like 1907, bank runs, bankruptcy, and collapse occurred. Over 5,400 competitive banks outside of the Federal Reserve System collapsed, further consolidating the monopoly of a small group.
As important it is for us to heal ourselves, it is also important to realize and remember why we're healing ourselves, so that we can be healthy, so that we can be sane, so that we can actually be in the present, in the future. Now, this is important because what type of future are you trying to get to? What do you want to live so bad for? If literally there is a group of people, a group of families, they want to say, that are literally manipulating 70% of the world right now to chaos out of order. Is that a world we want to live in? You feel me? So that's why it's important for us to ask the question, are we suppressing the truth in order to heal ourselves? Because, hey, that's temporary sometimes. You might need to do that. But before we get into this information, we have to drop our egos and actually drop our belief systems, whether you're black, white, religious, atheist, scientific, philosophical, or anything like that. Got to be able to drop that, because this is a problem that each and every last one of us are facing. Even some of the members of these banks are actually ignorant to the fact that they are part of this system, because it's that taboo. Now, in order to start this whole lesson, I want to give you a refresher of the mind. I was telling you about Zeitgeist, and in that movie, they were pretty much breaking it down. If you want to really get visual on this and not just see somebody talking, go look up the movie Zeitgeist. There's many other documentaries out there about the Federal Reserve Bank, but I'm here to announce the fall of the Federal Reserve Bank, because this is not just a speculation, for one, but simply because Uranus is in Taurus. And that's astrological right there. That's astrology. But just because Uranus is in Taurus, this energy of the Federal Reserve Bank is going to be transformed over. It's not going to die out. When I say the fall of the Fed, that means its power is decreasing. But that does not mean they are not a threat to you, and they're not your only threat. So, with that being said, let's start this off by talking about what the Federal Reserve is. The Federal Reserve is 12 banks that are spread out throughout the country. These banks are in major cities like Atlanta, New York, Boston, Arizona, Oklahoma, many cities that we are familiar with through their propagation of this. Now, the 12 banks, or the 12 branches of the Federal Reserve Banks, are the actual stocks of the people who own the Federal Reserve Banks. Now, you have to see this as a tree. Okay, now at the root of the tree, you have a group of people who you're never even going to know about who actually control this shit, because there's not even information out there about them. All the information I got today, I literally got it off the federalreserve.com .gov website. So they are not hiding this information, and neither can they, because before the Federal Reserve Act, which was signed in 1913, was signed, over 60% of the American population at that time was opposed to this. Now, even up to the Great Depression, many of the population was opposed to this. But you have to start seeing how greedy and how manipulative these people actually are, the Federal Reserve. You have to understand that by 1913, when they signed this act of the Federal Reserve Bank, people were so opposed to it that the Federal Reserve literally started a war just to distract the country from it and to gain the country's trust. And how did they do that? The Federal Reserve is actually a group of men who are linked back to what we consider, what a lot of humans consider, royalty in Europe. Now, the only difference between the royalty in Europe that we see in the Federal Reserve Bank is that the Federal Reserve Bank and the royalty go hand in hand. Now, the royalty that you see in the regalness is presented to the public, is propagated to you to make you feel like my major threat is only the political leaders in my government. But in actuality, your political leaders are all chosen by the most powerful and rich group of people in that region at that time. Now, that is going to be tough for some people to understand, but you really have to get it across your mind that this is a tree. The Federal Reserve System is a tree, and at the root you have the royalty. You have the people who you're never going to know about. Now, after this stump starts coming up, that's when you can start seeing it. Now, the stump of the Federal Reserve System is the actual countries. You see, the borders and the people inside of those borders are the stump. Okay, the Federal Reserve will have no leaves. They will have no power at all. They will have no existence above the dirt and the ground in their greediness. This is a symbology for the tree, of course. the root of the Federal Reserve System would never be shown light if it was not for the people and the conditions of the population of people and countries. Now, this is going to be key for other people to understand too. The Federal Reserve cannot exist if we don't have countries. Matter of fact, what they do is they invade countries. They begin what we call commonwealths here, which is just land that somebody bought off from a group of people. And if they don't agree to it, they just murder them. The Federal Reserve banksters, they just murder them. And they build commonwealths. And these become the major economic drive for the countries. And that's what we've seen with Washington, D.C. Okay, the District of Columbia. Now, you know that there's 12 branches of the Federal Reserve Bank, 12 key branches. But it's also important to realize that you are holding those 12 branches up. You are the tree stump. You are the fucking body of the tree that the stems and the leaves are going to come out of. Now, this is important because the root is channeling the energy from the earth and is sending it through you to these leaves and these stems. And this is what these are what the 12 districts are. Okay. The 12 districts, Federal Reserve banks, that are in various parts of the country. They are the distributors and collectors of the Federal Reserve notes that the Congress allows the country to use as a currency. Now, the Federal Reserve Act of 1913 was originally for 20 years. They signed this act and they said, okay, we need support from an outside entity for 20 years. Because during the time of 1913, the American population was facing a lot of conflict inside of its own borders. There was still a lot of post-Civil War conflict going on. So that really fucked up the economic flow of our country at that time. So what the Congress at the time was imagining, to an extent, because they were bribed, but what they were imagining is that if we have a centralized banking system, then it would stop the conflict and continue on the economic flow of the country and raise our overall standard of living. With this being said, you have to realize that there was also a great boom in technology during that time. The Industrial Revolution was happening. So they wanted to be in on that. They didn't want to be left behind. And they knew that one of the best ways to do that was to open up the borders for centralized banking. Now, centralized banking simply means that we're going to go back to the tree analogy. Simply means that instead of the tree flowing naturally, getting energy whenever it wants to, according to what it needs, and if it doesn't need any fucking energy or water or sunlight, then it simply doesn't pick it up. Instead of that happening, imagine a central bank. And what that is if the tree is cut down, took into a foreign land, and literally its only way of living is based on whether or not a human gives it water and gives it simulated sunlight. Okay, you got to see it like that, because the centralized bank, the central bank of any country, is ran by private entities. And you have to also see that the central bank is just like a monopoly of banking. Why would you want to have a monopoly for your banks? Oh, I know why. Because everybody who you consider to be the Illuminati, everybody who you consider to be actually oppressing you, which goes back to the white versus black thing and the race thing overall, they are actually members of the Federal Reserve Bank. Now, this is key, because if all of the conflict in your country is coming from the central bank and its members who are living in the 12 different districts, the members of the Federal Reserve Bank who are working together when they are under the Federal Reserve system and under the Federal Reserve identity, they work together in harmony. But when they go back to their separate 12 districts and they work and they do the work, and we know that the work refers to a lot of Masonic and Illuminati terminology. The work, they do the work in their different districts, and they push different conflicts, they push different divisive ideologies in these districts, and they make sure that their district is in prime to stay under the control of the Federal Reserve Bank. And I'm going to tell you how. You see, this goes back to the fact that the Federal Reserve Act of 1913 was for 20 years originally. But in 1927, the Congress recharted the Federal Reserve Banks into perpetuity, which literally just means I don't know how to say that word, but we just gonna say the Federal Reserve Act of 1913 was originally only designated to be in place for 20 years. So that would have meant that it would have inspired in 1933, which is exactly when the fucking Great Depression happened. But in 1927, the Congress recharted the Federal Reserve Banks into a bond or a security with no set expiration date. Now, imagine you going to the store and you want some milk of some sort. Or let's say, you want something that is sensitive to the timing. And you don't see a fucking expiration date on that shit. You're not going to pick it up. And if you do, there's a chance you're going to get bit in the ass and get sick because it could be old. This is important. Why would the Congress in 1927 rechart the Federal Reserve to have no expiration date? This is important because this was brought through an act called the McFadden Act. Okay, now you got to realize in 1913, the Federal Reserve Act was signed in Jekyll Island in secrecy. So that means for at least 2 years, the mass majority of the population of America didn't even know the Federal Reserve was the central bank of America at that time. They didn't know. They had no clue. There's no CNN at that time. The only thing they had was newspapers. And a lot of the population of Americans at that time couldn't even read. Okay? So they signed this in secrecy in 1913. A couple years later, we entered World War I. This is no coincidence, because most of the people who knew about centralized banks, they knew about it through their grandparents and great-grandparents at that time, who told them about what happened when the centralized banks during Abraham Lincoln's era and during Andrew Jackson's era. Is it a coincidence that these are two of the only 3 presidents that were assassinated? And the other one, JFK, was assassinated for trying to do the same thing, which was kick out the central banks out of this country. Now, this is why JFK is so respected among the conscious community to an aspect. But we have to start seeing that this goes back to the current situation we're in, goes back to 1913. And JFK was so late on that even if he tried to do what he was trying to do, it would have only made it worse for us. We would have been enslaved to his family. Now, hear me out, family. For 2 years, nobody knew about the Federal Reserve Act. So in 1915, 1916, when we entered World War I, that's when they started opening out themselves to the public, because they knew for a fact that America needed money for this fucking war. That's simple. Now, if you go to war, you're going to need tanks, you're going to need gas, you're going to need food for the soldiers, you're going to need boats, you're going to need guns, you're going to need bullets, you're going to need fucking gas masks, you're going to need so many things. War is the most expensive thing on earth. War is literally like building another planet on our planet. Now, we were pushed into World War I, the same way we were pushed into World War II, simply because as more people started to be more conscious of the fact that we had a central bank in America, they started to question whether it would be loyal to the population of the citizens. And you can see it as a distraction, or you can see it as a tactical, mass tactical operation. So when you go to war and you give the most of your financial backing to this country, America, at that time, then you let them win that war because you give them more material, then they trust you. They're happy. After World War I, we're all happy as fuck, and then we enter what is called the Roaring Twenties. The Roaring Twenties. And what happens in the Roaring Twenties is when we have what we call the Renaissance, or I forgot what it's called, but basically it's when the black people and the white people were cool with each other up in New York, and you had a cultural upbringing in America, the American Renaissance, or I can't remember what happened, but you got to remember that this is also following this is also during / in a transition stage between the Industrial Revolution and the downfall during the Great Depression. We have to see that during the Roaring Twenties, the Renaissance was the cultural backlash of the Industrial Revolution, which gave us a push in this country to be able to do everything faster and be more connected than ever. But we have to see that the Industrial Revolution was a side effect of the centralized banks of America wanting to lock down our country, because every single industry that was brought during the American Revolutions, like the train industry, the gold industry, the car industry, the what's that shit called? The mass production industry, the steel industry, all these things were actually pushed by and financially backed by people who were already financially backed by members of centralized banks in other countries who were trying to get this country under their centralized control or centralized banking system. With that being said, if Carnegie and all these different people, Ford and all these people, and JP Morgan, if all these people were members of the Federal Reserve Bank, and it just so happens that what we consider to be the Industrial Revolution was a side effect of all these people, then you have to see that they were the ones who were truly in control at that time. The Congress, the president, and the whole government were acting off of these people who had monopolized already in the 1920s. By the time the 1920s came around after the war, The people who had monopolized all of the industries, they were in such control that they were choosing congressmen and presidents already. And this is not even a centralized bank itself. This is literally just the monopolies of the industries that we now can literally base our whole life off of, which is trucks, transportation, mass production, and steel. Big ass tall buildings for no reason. This is why in 1927 the Congress rechartered the Federal Reserve Banks into perpetuity. I got that word right finally. When they did this, it was all as a result of the American government and the American population being in a hostage situation. The Congress of the American population was the hostage. And they wanted to trade in the Congress for hostages for our whole population. And in return, the Congress got money. And they got an upper hand. Now, in order to secure the Federal Reserve Act of 1913 would not be reversed in the future, after 1933, when it was up, they signed it 6 years early to rechart it into perpetuity, which means it has no expiration date. With that being said, to this day, we are under the Federal Reserve Act of 1913, the centralized bank, something that started in secrecy, is now literally the only form of control and government we have in our country, or have on this land. Now, the Federal Reserve infiltrated America in the 1920s mostly after being signed into the McFadden Act of 1927, which gave the Fed a chance to gain Americans' trust through the financial backing. So in 1927, this act was signed for no other reason whatsoever besides to guarantee the 12 Federal Reserve banks do not leave their districts and can control and can expand their power in order to maintain their survival, the bank's survival. You see, after the McFadden Act was signed, before the McFadden Act was signed and people were becoming more and more conscious of the fact that we had a centralized bank, they started to question, were all of these advances real? Was the Renaissance real? Was the Industrial Revolution something actually good for the country, or was it something that was harming us in the long run? So what they had to do was make up something called the Roaring Twenties, which is a time in which they gave people, in a way, financial freedom to buy whatever they want. Whatever you want, you can have it. Because guess what, nigga? The Fed is printing our money. We don't need to worry about running out of this shit. We can literally print however much we want. But what about the gold standard, friends? What about the silver and gold standard? Well, the Congress in 1927, after signing the McFadden Act, allowed the Federal Reserve banks immunity from any type of gold and silver standard, which is why in return, a couple of years later, they ended up having what's called the gold grab. They literally took everybody's gold in the country and told them a lie that they needed it and that whenever they want it, they can get it back. All they got to do is take these Federal Reserve notes to banks, to one of the Federal Reserve banks. This would be comparable to your neighbor knocking on your door. You open the door and they're like, "Hey, bruh, I gotta use all the plugs in your house. Now, I need these plugs to make sure that the whole neighborhood can have energy. If I don't plug up all my shit into your plugs, then you won't have a chance to get any energy at all yourself." That's comparable to that, because how can you, first of all, they didn't even have to walk. How can you take a whole country's currency and tell them that it's theirs still? You can't. So after they took all the gold, this is when they started utilizing the McFadden Act and the expansion and power that they were given, but nobody really knew about. The same way that a lot of the laws are being passed nowadays and nobody's really paying attention to it until they act on it. The McFadden Act revised almost all of the banking laws in the country and even went on to legalize new practices that were banned. For example, subsidiary corps, which means it allows member banks of the Federal Reserve to own and operate subsidiary corporations. Before the McFadden Act was signed into place, literally groups of rich-ass people couldn't come and just buy your shit, because that left a great chance for them to exploit the income of the American currency. Meaning they could take your money. If it's a group of men, they could take your money. Let me straighten this out. If it is a group of powerful bankers that want to buy out your shit, they can take your operation, turn it into something they want it to be, and manipulate the people who are using it, for one. But secondly, even more importantly, they can take all the economic input that operation brings, and they could exploit it and take it somewhere else where it's worth more, and leave this country leaving this country in a negative. There's no profit in that for this country. So why would they allow member banks to own and operate subsidiary corporations? That makes no sense. It also affected the type of, the McFadden Act, that is, also affected the type of loans, and allows a federal member of the bank to expand its range of operation from a single corporation to a complex corporation with multiple layers and many locations. Okay, we gotta read that one more time so you can understand it. The McFadden Act also affected the types of loans that the members of the Federal Reserve Bank can give out and receive from other international banks. There's no restrictions on that anymore after 1927, because the McFadden Act allows these banks to give you false loans, basically. They allow the Federal Reserve banks to also be able to give you fake money and demand real money back. Now, as I'm gonna continue, and it allows the McFadden Act, allows a member bank to expand its range of operation from a single corporation to a complex corporation with multiple layers and many locations. Now, this is important because what I'm about to say in this next part is going to make a lot of sense. You see, once you're allowed to give out fake loans, and then you're also given the power to have many layers of operation in many locations. And then on top of that, in the same act, you were given a subsidiary corporation law, which allows member banks to own and operate subsidiary corporations, which means the financial backing of the Federal Reserve can be used anywhere in the country for anything. This was based on gold and silver at a point in time, yes. At this point in time, when they passed the 1927 Act, this was based on gold and silver. But you have to realize, a couple years later, the Federal Reserve literally pulled all the gold and silver out of the country because we owed them
money is the supreme prerogative of government. Adopting these principles will save the taxpayers immense sums of interest, and money will cease to be the master and become the servant of humanity. What do the fears expressed by Jefferson and Lincoln and modern-day economists have to do with what President George Bush called the New World Order?
It's a conspiracy. What else can you call it? It's a conspiracy against the people of the United States and of the Western world.
Just when you think you're ahead of the game, someone changes the rules.
This week, we'll visit the scene of a crime so huge that most of you will not believe it to be real, and so perfect that even today, 86 years after the fact, few realize that the crime even took place. The creation of the Federal Reserve System was about more than just money. Some refer to it as the secret birth of a criminal conspiracy to rob the American middle class of its hard-earned wealth. Others believe it to be part of an attempt to bring the world under the control of a shadowy international elite that calls itself the New World Order. And through it all, we have wars, assassinations, and Martians. In fact, if it weren't for the Martians, you might have heard about this mother of all conspiracies a long time ago.
We know now, within the early years of the 20th century, this world was being watched closely by intelligences greater than man's.
them so much money during the roaring 20s when we had all these quote unquote good times. We were spending so much money. And by the end of the decade, we owed them so much money that our Congress had to do something. The McFadden Act was in a way, it was like a distraction for the Federal Reserve. Like, and the Congress was saying, oh, we can't give y'all all our gold and silver. So here, y'all can have these couple rights that we weren't giving you before to make you more comfortable here, to make you see that we not trying to jug you, bruh. The Federal Reserve goes, oh, no. We not worried about you jugging us, nigga. Just go ahead and keep spending. We not worried about it. And this is why we're in the situation we're in now. We live in a post-consumerism world. Now, eventually you had somebody come along, Theodore Roosevelt. He passed out some of these laws that were pushing back against these federal centralized banking. But really all he did was stall, hoping that the country would catch up, because the Great Depression is actually a result of them pulling all of the gold and silver out of our country. That's the simple facts of it. Now, once they pulled out the gold and silver out of our country, out of our currency, all we had was invaluable paper. Now, this is the same thing that they were telling you about in Germany after they lost World War II, that they had to take a whole fucking bucket full of money to the store to get a loaf of bread because it was worthless. What the fuck can you do with paper? Now, you have to realize that Germany was the Americas of the 17 and 1800s. They were the most powerful country during those two centuries. And leading up to the time of World War I and II, that's when the rest of Europe started getting jealous. And these centralized banks had Germany so in debt that they had given Germany so much shit. They had given them so much fake money to flow their economy off of. They are actually building good shit with it. And they were actually making technological advances with this stuff. And the centralized banks could not let them gain so much power that they could get rid of the central bank and still be powerful without them. Because they know for a fact that they gonna come and drop the bomb on the fucking wherever the fuck they at. And this is what they did with our country. In order to destroy Germany, who they had used for so long, they needed us. And in return, they promised our country that if we bring down this villain, we're going to have all the freedom in the world. We're going to be able to spend like how we were spending before. The Great Depression is a result of our actions as citizens. That's what they were telling us. So, as the Federal Reserve gained more permanent power over the years, because the populations over the years were opposed to the centralized bank, especially after the Great Depression, when a mass amount of people died from starvation and became more ignorant than ever and didn't have money to do anything. That's when people were starting to question, what exactly are we doing with the centralized bank? And immediately they gave you benefits. Benefits to make you shut the fuck up. Now, what are benefits in reality? A benefit is temporary. A benefit always turns to an asset for somebody else. It's like doing somebody a favor. They're going to want something back in return. The key to this is that we have lost grip of reality. The Wizard of Oz, the movie, is literally about the Federal Reserve Bank. And so is the Hunger Games. Why am I bringing up these two random movies? Because these are the two most popular films in American history. And somehow we are not aware of the fact of what they're actually getting at in the movies. And this is because we have become hyper ignorant of the financial system. The only thing you know about the financial system is loans, debt, and I forgot the other one, to be honest. But with those two alone, you already shut down because you're so busy paying bills, which is debt. And which is why you have Bill Clinton, which is why they pass bills. They pass bills. You have acts and you have bills. And what is a bill? Why do they pass bills? Because the government and the Congress is under the control of the Federal Reserve Bank, who they have to get financial credibility from in order to enact law or a new ideology or any type of change that the Congress wants to make. They literally have to go to the Federal Reserve centralized bank and ask them for it, and they will set up a plan for them, and then in return they're going to give them money, and in return that bill is passed because the central bank accepted the fucking trade that they going to give them some money, and in return in the future we're going to give them back something. The population of the country, that is, not the Congress, but the population of the country is going to give that back because we are paying for the bill. We are paying the bill. We don't, you feel me? We don't in this country just make change. We literally are so enslaved that we have to get a centralized bank to push what we need to happen into effect. That's how lazy and how used to we are to having this centralized bank. Why? Okay, that's one thing. You got the bills. Now we're going to have to get into the fact that the 12 districts of the the 12 districts of the Federal Reserve Bank, they are not 12 different families. Okay, this is an illusion and a lie that they tell you. The Federal Reserve Bank is like the front man for the actual centralized bank. And the centralized bank is nothing but a group of people who have monopolies on our industries. Once you have a monopoly on the industry, you have excess money. Once you have excess money, you have enough to give it out to the rest of the population. Once you have enough to give it out to the population based on your own control, and once you have so much money that you can give it out to other people, then the other people know this and they're going to start looking to you for that anytime they can. And eventually you're going to start seeing those motherfuckers as slaves. You can take advantage of these people. And how can we not realize this? That the monopolies that we give into and continuously give into, which are like industries that we think we need, that's all the monopoly is. It's a surplus of need, which is a very big contradiction. Because you can never have too much of what you need. So that means that what we think we need isn't real, because all of the people who own, who are members of the Federal Reserve banks, they change over time. But the thing is, they never leave power though. And that's why they gave the Federal Reserve Bank the ability to control and operate basically subsidiary corporations. Because if you have a monopoly on a certain industry and you put your money into the Federal Reserve Bank and you have a part in that, then you could decide what is going to be financially backed in this country or not. And you could decide to not financially back your opponent and your company's competition. You can just not support them and they'll die out after 10 years. But what if literally that's one district's only way of getting that product or something they need? Then you just literally ruin that district's life, or you just ruin that area's life. So what do? You put your company there and you set the prices based on how you see fit. And this is what is going on in this centralized banking. That's all a centralized bank is. It controls the flow of the currency in a land. So it's time for us to wake up, because as important it is for us to be vegan, as important it is for us to make healing choices in our lives, as important it is for us to reverse the brainwashing that we have, you will not be able to reverse that brainwashing if you do not come to the understanding and the conclusion that your enemy is not the devil, your enemy is not your family, your enemy is not yourself, your enemy is the fucking Federal Reserve Bank. The centralized banking system that we're a part of and support every single day that we wake up and live, the surplus of need, the surplus of wants, the consumerism that we're a part of is all a result of the centralized bank. We have to decentralize a bank. We have to decentralize the bank if you're going to make any change in the world. And the only way to do that is not by following your sovereignty from the fucking country, because no matter where you go, you're still going to be using the centralized bank's money. So you might as well be a part of the country, because even if you're not a part of the fucking country and you're using their money, you are still under debt. Okay? So I just like to put out there that we've been distracted. Nobody is telling us about the Federal Reserve Bank anymore. Nobody's teaching us about how the currency is going to crash, and nobody's telling you about. Only time they do talk about the Federal Reserve Bank is when they tell you about how the currency is going to crash and how the Fed is going to fall. But I know for sure this time that this is real and that they're going to get weak very soon, because the only way they're going to maintain strength is if they go to war. Because around a time like this, when people are becoming more conscious and becoming more aware of their decision making and trying to become better people, they don't come out and say, hey, y'all are fucking up our money, and y'all fucking up our economic system, and y'all fucking up our control over y'all country. They don't do that. They just simply say, hey, there's somebody over here y'all need to fight, but that's bigger and badder than us. And it's all an illusion. We can't fall for it, and I don't think we will fall for it, which is why when they financially back these countries to go to wars, and a lot of people choose not to do it and not support it, then it's going to devalue the money, because that is the beginning of people seeing that the backing that we are getting from this money is actually our own oppression, and it's actually what's keeping us in debt. You will not be able to pay off the debt of this country if you don't stop using the fucking currency that you're using. With that being said, family, Soulja is here to help you create, grow, and transform to new levels. And this is a lesson that's going to help you be able to unleash that. It's going to help you be able to unleash that self-hate and that self-suppression of what's actually going on in your own environment. Because I gotta be real, the generation that I'm growing up in, we've all been distracted so hard with this spirituality shit, and it's all fake spirituality. It's all consumerism in actuality. It's all to get you hyper egotistic. And who's pushing these propagandas? Who's pushing these industries of gems and crystals and shit to make you calm and pushing meditation on you to make you okay with all the bullshit going on in the world? It's the centralized banks, nigga. Anytime anything is on the market at all in this fucking country, it's just like going to China and try to open up your own fucking store. You're gonna have to go through a fucking governmental process before you can even open up your store, nigga. And they're gonna have to make sure that shit is useful to them. It's just like that here. No matter what you say, if it's good or bad, if you think it's good or bad, it's not. It's literally currency. And if you are on the fence about whether or not money is good or bad, you can simply look at the music, my family, and listen to how recently they've been trying to convince us more and more to actually fall in love with money. More and more fall in love with money. Fall in love with the money. Fall in love with the money. You got songs like This Is America. You got songs like ATM by J. Cole. You got songs like Cream going back all the way to Wu-Tang. You got so many songs that's praising money in the rap culture in the black community that we should have been questioned. Like, when Zeitgeist came out, why the fuck are they pushing this shit so much? Why the fuck are they pushing American culture and that the money is the most important thing? Even though we living in a racist place, even though we living in hell, even though we getting shot by cops, even though literally women are being beaten and there's injustices in the feminist communities and all these different, problems that we consider to be problems. And somehow the answer is never social for people. People are not saying go talk to each other or go work it out, go negotiate how real people do, how the centralized banks make decisions. They negotiate. But what they telling us to do is fight with money. Whoever has the most money is whoever's going to win. So the gay people, they got the most money, so they going to win. So the black people, they got the most money, so they going to win. So the white people, they got the most money, they going to win. But in reality, whoever is not focusing on money the most is going to win. Because they want your ass at work. They want your ass to stop having babies, nigga. They don't want you out here thinking on your toes, because they know as soon as we're not distracted, then we're going to realize that the money ain't shit. You're going to need to listen to a nigga talking about money over and over in the same key and repetitive fucking tones on your way to work to inspire you to go do this bullshit. And the reason you going to work is not because you want to go to work. It's because you want to make money. And the reason you're making money is not because you love money, like how the songs and the bullshit is telling you. It's because they've literally taken and robbed our country and monopolized and have a small group of people controlling the manufacturing of everything that you need and want. That's simple. Everything that you need and want. Soulja, we created a system to break out of this habit of money. Everything that money encourages you to do and can do for you, Soulja does and replaces that. You don't need that. Stop praising that shit. Y'all niggas praise money more than God. Y'all say y'all atheists, but y'all fucking praising money. So now's the time to reverse your brainwashing. Now's the time to actually become aware and conscious, because you fucked up the first time. They got your ass distracted until you watch this video and you realize, wow, there is no racial war. There is no religious war. There is no philosophical misunderstandings. It all goes back to the fact that we've been letting a central bank rule every asset of our fucking system and of our fucking communication and of our interaction with each other. You are now left with the responsibility to figure out a way to make this world go round without money. That's your only responsibility. That's your only responsibility right now. If they can do it back in the 1800s without all this technology and weapons and shit, and they simply kicked out fucking central banks and was doing fine and making their own notes, if they could do that then, why we can't do it now? We so much more advanced than them. if we consider ourselves to be spiritual and more morally acceptable, if we consider ourselves to be progressive or evolving into something better, the Aquarian age is here. We're better people. We're smarter. We're more useful. But somehow we can't even stay conscious of the fact that we're living in a centralized banking system, and and have the responsibility to realize that all of our problems can be stopped if we simply took responsibility and what is motivating us to do what we do in life. And with that said, I love y'all.